Good morning, everybody. We'll be starting in about 20 seconds. So go ahead and grab yourself a seat. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's very quiet now, so you know that we are starting right now. I'm very happy that you're here. We're gathering, we're gathering to celebrate the Spirit flowing through each of us and all things. And we have wonderful practitioners in the service that are holding the service and anchoring for us.
Okay, next I would like to share the reading for today, which is by Ernest Holmes. He says, "What good is the possibility until it is used? What good is knowledge unless we make practical application of it? One of the great difficulties in the new order of thought is that we are likely to indulge in too much theory and too little practice. As a matter of fact, we only know as much as we can prove by actual demonstration. What the world needs is spiritual conviction, followed by spiritual experience. I would rather see a student of this science prove its principle than to have him repeat all the words of wisdom that have ever been uttered. It is far easier to teach the truth than it is to practice it."
Well, today the topic is power of spiritual practice. And Hero has just really kind of messed my whole plan up. Because my plan was this. I was going to begin with an axiom, and the axiom is practice makes perfect. And I was going to say, but probably not. But obviously, in his case, practice has made perfect. And so that's a great example of it. But, you know, for a lot of people, it doesn't work that way. Practice doesn't always make perfect. I, as he mentioned, play the guitar a wee tiny bit. And I started when I was about 12. And I did practice. I played a little bit every day, and I did that for weeks and months and even years. And I learned a few songs. I could play some of the songs on the radio. And so the people around me said, "You're really good, Bill." Now, I knew I wasn't really good. I was just a rhythm guitar player, and I was playing some chords so that we could sing. So it wasn't that good, and I knew that. And it certainly was not perfect. And then after high school, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, so that, I was going to go to college, and I did. But I was also interested in music and what they did in the studios, and it just happened, just coincidentally, the roommate I had was named Jerry, and he had a part-time job working for a recording studio downtown. Just happened that way. And it was a small studio in front of the RCA studio. And back in those days, unlike now, you could go downtown and it didn't matter who was recording. I'm talking really famous people of the day could be recording, and you just open the door, go in and listen to them. And nobody would kick you out or anything. You just kind of act serious. Although, you know, you look like a college kid, I know, but they'd let you stay and you could listen to all kinds of people. Met several people there, and because of his influence, met some people that made a living doing music as studio musicians. And I remember one guy, Jerry Gillespie, who was making a living as a studio musician and writing songs. And he'd get up every morning, write songs, and he was making a good living doing that. And you could hear his songs on the radio. So it was amazing to me how good people could really be. And they'd practiced for years and had innate talent and tremendous dedication. And they were really good. I wouldn't say they were perfect. And they would never say they were perfect. But they were impressive and they were good. I remember a guy, and this wasn't back then, it was later, but a guy said something like, "Practice doesn't make perfect, it just gives you a really big headache." And I think that may be closer to the truth. Because it doesn't matter what we're doing, if we're shooting for perfection, it may sound good, but for so many people, it's really hard. It's a hard row to hoe, I suppose. If I were from Kentucky, I'd say that. It's a hard road. It's a rough road trying to be perfect. I have a couple of friends who were pretty good, and they left performing because they said it was just too much pressure. And they didn't want to leave music, so they became music teachers. And I knew a couple of other guys, probably more than that, who left music altogether. They just said it was just too much, and there was too many things involved. And it was just, I guess, summing it all up, it was just very stressful. Now, I've heard it all my life, practice makes perfect. But I just don't think that's true most of the time. And when we're trying to be perfect, sometimes it ends up sucking all the joy out of life. Sometimes it ends up causing you to give up on the thing that for a while you loved a great deal. I was reading a book just over the last couple of weeks by Thorne Coyle. And she, in that book, sort of gave me some of this idea, and she restated this axiom in her book. And she said, practice does not make perfect, but practice does make possible. And I really like that. That made a lot of sense to me. It seemed more true to me. And it's true in the music business. The more you practice, the more becomes possible. You'd known more notes and more chords and more techniques and how to move faster, and you'd learn lots of things. So practice does make possible. It makes possible. Now, she wasn't talking about music. She was talking about spiritual practice. And for me, that's even harder than music would be. It's harder because in spiritual practice, if you're going for perfection, then it means you're dealing with your internal motivation. You're dealing with your thoughts. You're dealing with your emotion. And so when you're trying to be perfect in all of those kinds of things, it really makes it hard to do. But if practice is really about opening up the possibility, just opening up what might happen, but wouldn't happen without the practice, that makes a lot more sense to me. And so you're expanding the boundaries of what could happen in your life. That's what spiritual practice is about. It's about expanding the boundary. It's not about becoming perfect. And if you're thinking you're going to become perfect through spiritual practice, it sort of ruins the whole thing in most cases. But if you think it's going to open up the possibilities, it becomes a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, I believe you and I were born to engage the sacred. I believe you and I were born to engage ritual. And ritual is an exciting thing. Human beings for thousands of years have had rituals for planting crops and for the harvest and for the way the body changes and for relationships. We practice ritual for a long, long time. Dancing, singing, feasting, chanting, praying, all kinds of things. And those rituals were not done at random times. They were done at prescribed times for very specific reasons. You can see that right now, this time of the year, as the sun diminishes and then it begins to come back, we have holidays and holy days, and lots of them, celebrating probably the coming back of the light. I especially think that ritual connects us to the earth. And I think they connect us to animals. And I think ritual connects us to each other sometimes. But as the centuries have progressed, we've let go of most of that. Now, we have birthdays and anniversaries and weddings and things like that, but we don't have too much going on that really connects us to the heart of life and the heart of the earth. And here's what I have found. When my life is devoid of ritual, I tend to rush through it. When life is devoid of ritual, we tend to just rush through it. and we don't stop to think about the meaning of what's happening in our lives. We don't stop and think about the events of our lives because we're so busy. An event happens and we don't have time to really reflect. We immediately move to another one, and then another one, and another one, and there's no reflection. And that's sad that there's not the reflection of what things mean. We lose track of the big picture. If we were tracking an animal, we wouldn't find the animal. We lose track even of our own selves. Ritual gives us the opportunity to focus our attention on what really matters. And without ritual, we forget what matters. We forget what's important. Ritual reminds me of a drum beat. And the drum beat keeps the rhythm of life. And if we don't have the rhythm of life, we lose track. Spiritual practice gives us those kinds of moments. Spiritual practice can give us those kinds of drum beats to keep us understanding what really matters in life. And that's where our greatest joy comes from. And so it's moments to pause. It's moments to reflect. And I would even say it's moments to live. Because without the drum beat, what you're doing may not be exactly living. John Lennon said something like, life is what happens when you're making other plans. And so that applies, I think, especially to spiritual practice. And when you live in a sacred space, everything can become ceremony. One person would go through something and not sense or not feel, not experience anything, and someone else can go through the same thing and experience extraordinary things. It really depends. It gives us a place to stand. And so if you took me up on this and you decided you were going to engage in spiritual practice every day of some kind, what would you get? You'd get things like greater joy, greater meaning in life, greater patience with those people that irritate you. So much so that the thing that would normally irritate you begins to just create great love in you as you look and behold them. Your life begins to change. Compassion, integration of parts of yourselves you may not even be aware of, but you become aware of them and they become part of the whole scene of your life. I like the word equanimity. It means you can face really hard times, but your spirit remains at peace. Zen teacher Baker Roshi said, enlightenment is just an accident. But spiritual practice makes us accident prone. And I think that's absolutely right. Now, I remember at a pretty young age thinking to myself, and I didn't use these words, but I was thinking I'd like to have some kind of spiritual practice. And I remember at that young age thinking, well, I guess what I need to do is I need to start praying more often. Now, I didn't really understand very much about prayer at the time, and I didn't know how to pray, but I thought that's a good place to begin. But you and I are so different. I mean, I can look around and see all of you look different than I do. And if we could check your fingerprints, we know all the fingerprints are different. But the fingerprints, that difference runs through your entire body, your psyche, your thoughts, your emotional body, your spiritual body. All of us are so different. And so if we were going to choose a spiritual practice today, someone might choose prayer. Person next to them might choose meditation. Person over on the other side of the aisle might choose to get a huge poster board and make a sign to protest something and go out and march on the street to make the world a better place. We're so different. We're so different. And it makes sense to me because we are so different that all of us would do spiritual practice in a different way. One size doesn't fit all. And so we don't all have to be the same. I used to really enjoy listening to a minister when I lived in Asheville about 15 years ago. And her name was Reverend Maureen Killoran. And she wrote a chapter in a book about spiritual practice a few years ago. And the title of her chapter was Engaging the Heart. And it was one of those books where you have that title and then a second title. So engaging the heart, or practices that are grounded in relationships. And Maureen talked about her spiritual practice that she and her husband, she said, sort of created. I love the practice. She said every morning when the alarm goes off, they would find the book that they were reading. And that day it could be the Tao, it could be the book of Psalms, it could be New Testament, it could be Meister Eckhart, it could be anything. Deepak Chopra, it could be anything. And so they would take that book, and one of them would read that page or passage silently. And then the other one would read it out loud. And so both of them in that moment would have the experience of reading it and hearing it, and then reading it and just in silence. And then they would share their reaction to the reading. Each would offer a prayer or a wish for the day, and then they would end with just a simple benediction. And then in the evening, they had a practice of coming back and doing a corresponding practice, where they would take that same reading, and she described it this way, and she has a way with words. She said it this way: we began by taking turns rereading aloud the passage with which we began our day. Peter, her husband, reads, or I do, and then the book is passed and we listen to the other read. Hearing not so much the words as the voice of our beloved. Then, and this is crucial, no matter what kind of mood, you guys have moods, don't you? No matter what kind of mood we are in, we take one another's hands and we give to one another an appreciation, a gift of words. And we share something, either large or small, that our partner did that endeared him or her to us today. And frequently, the words come without bidding. I love you. And then she says this: I credit this simple ritual with saving our marriage and changing both of our lives. She's not one to exaggerate either, so powerful words. She says, we entered the world and the day more centered, more connected. And we've discovered a funny thing that happens when you make a habit of beginning a day and ending a day with spiritual practice, like exchanging appreciation. As we go about our lives, we find ourselves noticing the little things that would have otherwise been totally ignored. 3 words: details become dear. A touch of the hand, a smile in the midst of a tough moment, a routine exchange. She says of poor Peter, he still may leave his socks and his underwear in the floor. But we laugh together, and sometimes we cry. She says, I still slide too easily into impatience. But for the first time in my life, I love you is an ongoing feeling. Not just words that I'm supposed to say. It has become a present reality because of this ritual. There are 4 types of spiritualities. 4. 1, relationship, connection, and that's an example of that one. 2, what I would call justice work. You're doing something to make the world a better place. 3, deep thought or spirituality of the mind. Thought, study, reading, perhaps. And then 4thly, mysticism. Mysticism, connection to nature, to people, to the world. If you take those 4 types of spirituality, you can put a practice under each one. But you probably would not want to do that, because the spiritual theory behind the four of those is that most individuals lean toward one more than the other three. That we lean toward one. And so what you want to do is discover which one you lean toward, and then put a spiritual practice under that one. And it could be terribly, or I don't know if that's the correct word, but it could be amazingly enriching. Now, you may already be engaged in spiritual practice. Your spiritual practice, by the way, a spiritual practice can be anything. It could be building a boat. It could be working on your car. It could be cooking. It could be parenting. It could be a marriage. It could be social justice. It could be reading and gardening. It could be art. It could be prayer. It could be meditation. It could be yoga. It could be anything. Intention is what makes it sacred. Intention. Intention. Now, most of you know me at least well enough to know that I like categories. I like categories because they help me remember. I like categories because they help me think. I think in categories. So if I hear a first, second, third, and fourth in a talk, I love it. And so 4 points, and these are very brief. I've mentioned them, but I want to mention them one more time quickly. 4 categories of a spiritual approach to life, and you choose one. First one, relationships, connection. Doesn't have to be romantic. This may be where your spirit feels most at home, where you feel most comfortable. In the midst of relationships, you find your greatest joy and your greatest challenges. We often find great meaning in that. And it doesn't have to be romantic. It could be just a deep friendship, a close friendship. It could be that you meet with someone once a week and you take turns talking about the deep things of life and your deep reflections about your own life, and you just share that with someone. Connection, number 1. Number 2, the second realm deals with the intellectual kind of thing. Some people feel more spiritual when they're digging into understanding a concept and an idea. They love doing research. They love reading. And that is a great spiritual practice. They're looking for the details. Sometimes people just read and they study. Sometimes a lady named Susan Ritchie said that what she enjoyed doing is she takes a short passage in a book that's meaningful and she reads it out loud. And she says she reads it out loud maybe 15, 20 times. And she found that as she does that, it deepens inside of her. And she almost, and it sounds strange, but she almost enters into the reading and the words. That's spiritual practice, and that's how she engages. So deep thoughts, relationships. Number 3, the path of service or justice. Some people are most alive, most inspired, most connected to life, most connected to God, when they're actively working to make the world a better place. When they make a sign and go march down the street and say the world is going to be better because I'm doing this. Number 4. Number 4 is mysticism. Mysticism. Mysticism can take place in 2 ways. 2 big categories. One is you feel as if God is the ocean and you're part of the ocean, and there's total oneness between spirit and you. Mystical. Some people don't go that route. Some people feel as if God is huge and they're tiny. And sometimes that can feel overwhelming, and sometimes it can feel unbelievably comforting, as if they're being held by God. Both are mysticism. When someone says to you, or they say to me, I would just like to be more spiritual, most of the time, that's what they're talking about. Most of the time, they're talking about something that feels magic. Most of the time, they're talking about mysticism. And so I've said everything I've said today so I could ask you this question. The question is, what path appeals to you the most? I've mentioned 4. What path appeals to you the most? It might be relationships. It might be connection. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it could be yours. Or it could be thought and study and philosophy, and you love doing that. Or it could be social action. You want to make a difference in the world, a positive, beautiful difference. Or it could be mysticism. You want to go out and hug a tree. You want to sit in front of a lake and watch the water not move and feel what that's like. Now remember, don't you do a practice so you can be perfect, because that will be deadly. You do your practice so that you can expand. You do your practice because you create a space, and as you move into that space, the space enlarges. It enlarges. Sacred practice deepens us, enlarges us, connects us, and empowers us. And it helps us to live, and I love this picture in my mind, it helps us to live inside the possibility. Because so many times we're living with impossibility. And so it begins to open and widen, connect us. It is absolutely essential that you do something like this every single day. Essential. Every single day. You need the drumbeat. We need the drumbeat, or we get lost. And when we get lost, we become really, really small. Let's turn within. Well, we are thankful. We're thankful. Thankful for this community. We're thankful that we can be thankful. We're thankful to know that there's no spot where God is not. That means within each of us. And I'm relieved that I don't have to be perfect. I'm relieved that there's grace and there's practice. And we live in a universe full of grace. And so as we practice, whether it's primarily with relationships and connecting with others, or whether it's through study, thinking hard, or whether it's justice and doing good in the world physically, or whether it's mysticism. We see the power of spiritual practice, and we see how it can help us pause and find greater meaning. And it helps us not to rush through this life. And so in these moments, we open our minds, open our hearts, and consider on this day how we might change our perspective in some way so that we can engage the power of spiritual practice every single day. And as the beloved community, we say together, and so it is. Thank you.